Hello and welcome back to another episode of Haunted by the Past. Today I'm going to talk to you in the spirit of Halloween. I have some rather interesting and sometimes disturbing stories about things that have happened on Halloween. And where I am right now, it's very windy outside. You might be able to hear the howling wind, which just adds to the atmosphere. What do you think of when you hear the word Halloween? Trick or treat, costumes, witches, black cats, ghouls, pumpkins, and of course, candy, sweets, lollies, depending on which country you're in. While some think of Halloween as an American celebration, it's actually based on a Celtic festival. Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival, was first celebrated more than 2,000 years ago in County Meath, Ireland. It marks the true beginning of winter and is seen as the Day of the Dead. The Celts believed it was a time the veil between this world and the next came down, and those of fairies and the spirits of the dead that year moved on to the next life. But if the boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead overlapped, the deceased could come back to life and wreak havoc amongst the living. All Hallowtide is actually one of a 3-day celebration from the 31st of October to the 2nd of November. All Saints' Eve, Halloween, All Saints' Day, All Hallows' Day, and All Souls' Day was created because the early Christian church had so many martyred saints to venerate that they couldn't all have their own feast day. In Edinburgh, they still have large processions of people carrying flaming torches alongside drums and music. It's a tradition that on Samhain people would dress up and disguise themselves so that the ghosts don't recognise them. Carved pumpkins are another tradition originating in Ireland, Scotland and England, where people carved menacing faces into vegetables and placed a candle inside to scare away the evil wandering spirits. Using pumpkins is an American spin on the ritual, but the first lanterns were made from hollowed out turnips. I remember this as a child, and personally, I think they look more evil than the pumpkins. Samhain is also a time to reflect on things that have ended in the past year, as well as the hopes for what may come in the next. Dia de Muertos, Day of the Dead, a Mexican tradition, dated back more than 3,000 years ago. It is also celebrated on the same 3 days. However, rather than fearing the dead, they celebrate the dead. Traditionally, once celebrated in early summer, the tradition aligned over the years with Samhain. Dia de Muertos celebrate at the graves of their loved ones in the spirit of rejoicing. Brightly coloured altars called ofrendas are decorated with sugar skulls, calaveras, and poems. Mexican marigolds are the traditional flower of the dead, and if you've watched Coco, you may already know some of these traditions. So the first story, and I think most of these come from America. The first story is taken from Reader's Digest Canada, Lifelike Halloween Display. A reported Halloween display looks so real with the decorations and ghoulish figures. That is because it was a real figure. A woman had sadly reportedly taken her own life and hung from the tree. Police think that this happened the night before. Passers-by just thought it was part of the display, and so, because it was Halloween, it wasn't reported for hours. This was on October 2005. But what was astonishing was that the house was across the road from other houses on a relatively busy road, and it's alleged that the body could easily be seen hanging 15 feet above the ground, would easily have been seen by passing vehicles. Very sad. Poison candy. Our next story comes from California. Again on Halloween in 1959, a dentist, William V. Shine, decided to play a mean practical joke. It's reported that he handed out 450 candy-coated laxatives to unsuspecting children, innocently trick-or-treating when they knocked at his door. It was not known why he did this, but around 30 children became sick, and even one child suffered irreparable harm. The laxatives were traced to the man's house, and he was charged with several crimes, including outrage of public decency. Powdered candy. The first death of a child after eating spiked candy was recorded in 1970, when a 5-year-old boy from Michigan died after ingesting a horrific amount of illegal substances. When the candy was tested, investigators found heroin dust on them. Parents went into panic mode. However, police later discovered that the boy had found his uncle's stash of the illegal substance and had mistakenly eaten it. The family of the boy had then sprinkled some onto the candy to cover it up and throw off investigators. That's very sad. Pixie sticks. Again on October the 31st in 1974, Ronald Clark O'Brien and neighbour Jim Bates of Deer Park, Texas, took their children out trick-or-treating. Bates's job was to wait on the sidewalk whilst O'Brien escorted the children to the front doors of neighbourhood houses. It's then alleged that O'Brien then disappeared briefly behind a shadowy part of the front porch and then re-emerged holding 5 large pixie sticks filled with flavoured sugar. Although no one saw the homeowners open the door, O'Brien claimed that the door had opened a crack and the candy was given to distribute to the children. Sadly, later that night, O'Brien dialed 911 stating that his son had apparently eaten poisoned candy. Unfortunately, paramedics were unable to save his 8-year-old son. An investigation later revealed that the candy had been laced with cyanide. But who would do this to a child's candy? Well, maybe a $40,000 life insurance payout to the boy's father may give you a clue. Yes, sadly, O'Brien sacrificed his own son in exchange for the life insurance. O'Brien was convicted of capital murder in June 1975 and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection in March 1984. But what about the other 4 children? Well, the man's 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth was one of them. But fortunately, she and the other 3 children miraculously escaped danger as the sticks were confiscated before they were ingested. Wow, that could have been a serial murder case right there. Mail for a corpse? A United States delivery driver failed to notice that the person he was delivering a parcel for was actually right on the doorstep. The driver stepped over what he thought was a Halloween decoration. However, this was the body of the owner he was delivering the parcel to. Dale Porch, 46, collapsed and died November the 2nd on his own porch steps after returning home from his night shift job. So the delivery driver just assumed that it was a leftover Halloween decoration. And when the reporters asked for a comment for the Postal Service, they just said they were dealing with it internally because the worker that had done this was a good worker, had no issues with him before, and this wasn't the kind of thing that he would do. So, yeah, interesting. So next time you see a Halloween decoration, just check it's actually plastic. Accidental hangings. These 2 cases are really, really sad. Pretty bad. On Halloween in 1990, 15-year-old William Anthony Ogden accidentally hung himself when staging a gallows scene in the basement of his house, intending it to look like a haunted house, when the noose, made of ski rope, somehow tightened. William was pronounced dead amid fake spider webs and plastic bats decorating an aunt's home. It was very sad. What I don't understand is that the ski rope, apparently, looking at further reports, he'd playfully just put the noose around his neck, joking, and the ski rope tightened. But what I don't understand is he would have had to be off the ground for him to actually be hung. So I don't understand did he slip when he put it on? I mean, how did he put the noose around his neck? Anyway, unfortunately though, a week earlier, a 17-year-old boy called Brian Jewell of Toms River died in Lakewood, New Jersey, whilst posing as a hanging victim for a haunted hayride. He was not supposed to have the rope around his neck, authorities said. Now, apparently, he'd asked for a job to work at this haunted hayride place with his mum, and the people that ran it said that they were full, they didn't need anyone else, but he protested and begged and said he would do anything. So his mum and the guy who owned the place gave in and said, okay, you can lay in the coffin and scare people. Unfortunately, he decided that was pretty boring and he wanted to swap places with the guy who did the gallows hanging part. He was meant to just stand there and scare people, not actually put the noose around his neck. And unfortunately, he took the display a little bit too far. So the article reads that Jewell's death was discovered about 8 p.m. by participants in a Halloween hayride at the Lakewood Riding Centre featuring costume performers. The hayrides, conducted nightly during October, are owned and run by Ocean Haunted Hayrides Inc. A group of hayriders approached the hanging scene, but Jewell, an employee of the firm, never gave them his haunting pitch. Instead, Jewell just stood limply on a platform, as if he really had been hanged, which sadly he had. Murder. For the better part of one day in October 2015, people assumed the human-like figure leaning against a fence in a small Ohio town was a gory Halloween decoration. It wasn't until that evening that they realized it was the battered corpse of Rebecca Cade, whose boyfriend had beaten her to death with a large rock. Her face was so bloodied and disfigured, neighbours at first assumed it was a Halloween prop. This is really, really sad and sick and pretty awful. So horrible for the girl. Elmer McCurdy. Now, this is a pretty famous one. You may have heard of this one. A dummy dead man on a TV set turned out to be the real thing. In December 1976, a Universal Studios camera crew arrived at the New Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach, California, to film an episode of the television action show $6 Million Man. I used to love that show. In preparing the set in a corner of the funhouse, a worker moved the hanging man, causing one of this prop's arms to come off. Inside it was human bone. But this was no mere prop. This was an actual dead person. The body was that of Elmer McCurdy, a young man who in 1911 robbed a train of $46 and 2 jugs of whiskey in Oklahoma. He announced to the posse in pursuit of him that he would not be taken alive. He was proved right. They killed him in the ensuing shootout. McCurdy began his career as a sideshow attraction right after his embalming. He looked so good dressed up in his fancy clothes that the undertaker propped him up in a corner of the funeral home's back room and charged locals a nickel to see the bandit who wouldn't give up. The nickels were dropped into the corpse's open mouth, from where they were later retrieved by the entrepreneurial undertaker. No next of kin showed up to claim McCurdy, so the corpse kept mouthing nickels for a few years. Carnival promoters wanted to buy him, but the undertaker turned them down. McCurdy was producing a steady income for the funeral parlour. Why would you sell him? In 1915, 2 men showed up and claimed that McCurdy was their brother. They hauled the body away, supposedly to give him a decent burial in the family plot. In reality, McCurdy's brothers were carnival promoters, and this was a ruse to get the deceased away from that proprietor undertaker. The promoters exhibited McCurdy throughout Texas under the same billing as the current undertaker had given him, the bandit who wouldn't give up. You'd think they'd come up with a different name so they wouldn't be rumbled. After that tour, McCurdy then popped up everywhere, including an amusement park near Mount Rushmore, lying in an open casket in a Los Angeles wax museum, and in a few low-budget films. Before the $6 Million Man crew discovered this prop to be a corpse, McCurdy had been hanging in the Long Beach Funhouse for 4 years. In April 1977, the much-travelled Elmer McCurdy was laid to final rest in Summit View Cemetery in Guthrie, Oklahoma. And to make sure the corpse would not make its way back to the entertainment world, the state medical examiner ordered 2 cubic yards of cement poured over the coffin before the grave was closed. McCurdy hasn't been seen hanging around amusement parks since. But I bet if his ghost was around, he'd be pretty annoyed. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this selection of Halloween horror stories. Hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. Stay spooky and happy Halloween.